before we start looking at setting a stone, we're going to look at the parts of a stone. The top of the stone right here is called the table. All right, the area in between the table and the widest part is called your crown. And then your widest part is that seam along the edge of the stone. That's called your girdle. All right, now the area in between the tip of the stone and the girdle is called your pavilion. And then that very tip, the point of the stone, is called the cullet. Okay, so now we want to measure our stone to figure out what size tubing to use. I'll usually flip the stone upside down so it's resting on its table, and then with my calipers, I'll grab them and measure it by the girdle. This one looks like it's 2.98, which is approximately 3 millimeters. I'll next put aside my burr that I'll be using, so I'll grab the 3 millimeter burr, and I'll usually open up the tubing by starting with one burr smaller. So I'll grab I think it's like a 2.75 millimeter. Now this here is what we call a daubing stick, which is basically a piece of wax with a handle on it, and we can just use that to move the stone around a lot easier than it is to just try and pick it up with your fingers. We'll next find the corresponding tubing. You want the tubing to be about 0.5 millimeters larger than the stone. Next, we're going to flatten the tubing. We can do that one of three ways. We can put it in the mitering jig. You put it in the V-groove, let it stick out the end just a little bit, and then if you have a longer tubing, you can put that in between the V-groove of the bench pin and file right up against the tool. Don't use your best files for this. A second way to flatten it is by taking a smaller length of tubing and chucking it up in your flex shaft. Tighten it up a little bit, and then with a file you can have your flux shaft spinning and use it kind of like a lathe and just file that in nice and flat. You should get a really good 90 degree. A third way of doing it is similar, but you take a small piece and you chuck it up in your drill press. Tighten it up a little bit, and then you put a little bit of sandpaper on a steel block or a piece of glass, something flat. And then you can turn your drill press on and flatten the end of the tubing just by gently pressing it up against the sandpaper. Okay, I always like to cut the seat before I solder the slice of tubing in place. So always use a little burr life or oil lubricant, and we'll start by burring with a smaller burr, and then we'll open it up with a 3 millimeter burr. I'll often use the mitering jig as a handle to hold on to the tubing, and then I'll line up the angle of the tubing with the angle of the flex shaft, so that way I know I'm burring straight. We want to burr at a slow speed, and the depth that we're going to aim for is so that the stone is going to sit so that the top of the tubing is about halfway up the crown. So to recap, we're using the burr to burr down into the tubing, and that's creating a seat or a bearing for the stone to sit in. All right, and we want the height of that, again, so that the top of the tubing is halfway up the crown. Okay, so when we finish, we want that to be the depth. So now we'll switch to the 3 millimeter burr, and we're just going to re-burr that seat a little bit, and it'll open it up a smidge. All right, and this is where we really want to pay attention to the depth. All right. And so you can see the seat right in there in the tubing, and now we'll test to see if we have the right depth. So once we get the stone in there, we'll take a peek. Want to double check to make sure we cut it level. And you want the stone just peeking up above the surface. Again, so the top of that tubing is about halfway up the crown. All right, so that looks pretty good. So now what we can do is we could take a slice of that tubing. I usually slice it a little longer than what I think I need, depending on how I'm going to attach it to the piece of jewelry that I'm working on. So now let's look at some jewelry. So this is a piece, and I'll actually set it in something like this, where again, the tubing for this style of setting, we're going to want it just above the surface of the metal. Right? And to prep that, we'll see the little groove there. That's put in with a burr. So I'll pick a burr that's about the same diameter as the tubing, and then I could actually use a file, a round file as well, but I kind of like the burr technique. So I'll just chuck this up in the flex shaft, and as I'm creating that groove, I'm pointing the tool towards the center of the ring. That way the setting will be straight. You can kind of see the groove there, and that'll make a stronger solder seam when I go and solder this tubing in place. And you'll see I left the tubing a little longer. That way when I solder it, it can kind of balance up on the ring. It makes it a little easier. This is a ring here where I tapered two ends. I took a file, a little bit of groove, and two pieces of solder to hold that tubing in place. Now this one here was a ring that I had cut through, and then with a burr created a little concave seat for the tubing, and then I could take the tubing, place it in there, and solder it. I usually put the solder on the inside because it's an easier cleanup. Now this is a ring that I've started, then I'm going to put a stone in one end where I've just tapered a longer piece, wrapped it around, then kind of split the two pieces apart. I'll go in there with a file or a burr, a round burr, and then I can slide the tubing and solder that in place. Now this is a hollow form ring that a friend of mine made, and what she did is she just took a slice of tubing and soldered it on top of the hollow form. Alright, now this is a ring where I drilled straight through the ring, slid in the tubing, and then soldered it from the inside, and then trimmed off the excess. So I put the solder there, solder it in place. It's a lot cleaner to solder from the inside of the ring because you won't get any on the outside. Now this ring doesn't have one, but that's how I would do this. I would do it in the same way where I drill a hole, put the tubing through, and place the solder on the inside of the ring. Now here's a brooch that I made where I have, I think I have 3 stones there. I have a little black diamond, white diamond, and a pink tourmaline. And so I just took a slice of tubing, and I incorporated it in the frame where I put a piece of solder here, here, and there, which gave it a good sturdy home. Now these two, I had some thick sheet frame, and then I put a groove in there. You can see the groove if we look on the back. Here, let me move the pin wire out of the way. And you can see I cut like a half circle into that sheet, which creates a little home for the tubing to sit in and a good solder connection. Okay, so our next step is to set the stone. All right, so here's a ring that I prepped. I first want to pick out the right size setting tool. So this is a conical shaped tube that fits over the tubing. So you pick one that just fits over the edge. You don't want it too big or you could damage the material around the tubing. And that's going to be used to push the bezel over the stone. So the edge of that tubing becomes the bezel. So we'll pop our stone in, double check to make sure it's level. Now we can set this in one of 2 ways. One way is you can put it on a ring mandrel, put something soft underneath it like a towel or a sandbag. Then we can use a tool and either strike or push with a pin vise. A preferred method that I like, and if you have a GRS interior ring clamp, I prefer that. It just holds on to the ring a little bit better. So we'll pick the right size collet, which I've already done. We'll slide our ring on, and then with the Allen wrench, we'll screw in a tapered screw that opens up the collet and grabs onto the ring. And that really secures it quite nicely in the Benchmate. Now this next step is if you've burred a seat in the stone sitting loosely. So what you could do is you can grab a little sticky wax and just push straight down on the stone and smear it across the top and rub off the excess wax. And that'll hold a stone in place so it doesn't move while you're setting it. And again, you only need to do this if the stone is loose. This stone actually wasn't loose, so I didn't need to do this, but it doesn't hurt. So now we'll place that on top and a little tap. Now, if your stone is a fragile stone, you might want to just put the tool in the pin vise and then give it downward pressure. Once you do that step, then we're going to finish off pushing the bezel down around the stone with a burnisher. And notice how I'm grabbing it right by the end of the burnisher. That gives me a fair amount of leverage. And sometimes I'll even use 2 fingers, and I'm bracing myself as much as I can so I don't slip with the tip of that burnisher. Burnisher tips can be a little sharp, so you want to be careful not to scratch up the metal around the bezel. And again, what I'm doing is I'm just pushing that metal down on the stone, just making sure it's fully set. Okay, after I go around a few times and I think it's pretty close, what I'll do is I'll take it off the Benchmade, then I'll go and run it under some hot water and use a brass brush to get out any of that excess wax. All right, and then I'll come back and just go one more time around just to make sure that it's fully set. Okay, then after this step, it's a lot of it's just cleanup. So for cleanup, we're going to use a pink rubber polishing wheel, which is a high polish wheel. If it's not flat, I like to flatten it on either a stone or some sandpaper. And we're going to use that flattened edge on the part of the bezel that we just pushed over the stone, just to clean up any marks left from the burnisher. Now the angle that you hold this tool is pretty important, so you want that flat edge right there, right up against the bezel part that's holding down the stone, and this other part is going to be perpendicular to that edge. Now notice the way I'm holding the flex shaft, so my thumb is right up against that tubing. That way I'm not going to slip and hit the stone with the wheel. Some stones can't take the abrasives of the polishing wheel. So now we can just inspect our work, preferably with some magnification. Okay, let's say we recap this process. So first, we're going to measure our stone. Grab our stone, put it upside down, table side on a flat surface. Use our calipers, measure our stone. Next, we're going to pick some tubing that is 0.5 millimeters larger than the stone. This looks about right here. Let's see, we'll measure. Yeah, 0.5 millimeters bigger than the stone. Okay, so now we pick out our burr that works. All right, now notice that the burr mimics the shape of the stone, so that creates a nice seat. Hold it at about a 45-degree angle, and we're gonna burr a nice seat. Okay, there we go. If you look in there, you can see it. I'll probably see it on this side better. Okay, so as we have the seat, we'll check, see if the stone fits nice and snug. Okay, looks good. We're about halfway up the crown, that edge of the tubing. Level it off. So now it's time to set it. We're gonna use setting tools first, which has a conical shape on the inside. All right, and that's going to push that metal over the stone. So we'll either tap or push and wiggle the setting tool so it pushes the metal over the stone. And then we're going to finish it off with a burnisher and a polishing wheel. And there we go, tube setting.